I want to come back to the case to be made for why the U.S. should arm Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
This is something that I'm struggling with as a leftist, because the kind of humanitarian case, the humanitarian desire to support a group of people who is being invaded, citizens through no fault of their own, who are trying to stay in their homes and protect their communities, is obvious. But the part of the conversation that gets hop-skipped over is whether or not the United States of America should be playing a role in supporting via distribution of arms. So there's like a couple parts to this. One, America's involvement, period. Two, whether it should come from offering quote unquote lethal aid as opposed to humanitarian aid. And that first question is really the imperialism question, right? How is America determining? How is the nation determining when it does and does not get into conflicts? Because the fact of its failure to intervene in other humanitarian moments, some of which are ongoing and some of which are of our own design, our own, we contributed to, causes some on the left to see this as, despite being perhaps more morally virtuous than other moments, ultimately reflective of some kind of pretext. And absent an ability to articulate a kind of moral line here, a moral litmus test, an interventionist litmus test, you are always going to have people who at the end of the day, despite their kind of emotional response or their abstract humanitarian response, do not feel it's appropriate for the United States to be participating in a conflict by providing weapons of death.
Yeah. So there's a pacifist left that has that view. That or at least that's not everybody, but some people absolutely. No war ever. Conscientious objector, not going to participate. Get it. Totally legitimate. But there's the other that's sort of the anti-imperialist left. And this is sort of where I started out. You know, I was protesting the Vietnam War. And the more I learned about the Vietnam War, the more I realized this was part of a pattern that goes back to at least 1898. Okay. Or you could say when European settlers first came to this country, just occupying other people's land and killing the people that were there. And there's no question that a lot of what U.S. policy has done is paved the way for Putin's invasion, NATO expansion. I was against it, and certainly at least the way it was done, ignoring Russia's legitimate security concerns. Our invasion of Iraq looks a lot like Putin's invasion of Ukraine, including even making up the lie that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, we had to go get them. The way Putin is claiming that Ukraine has nuclear weapons or is trying to get nuclear weapons, so he has to go in and do it. So all that. So you can be critical, as I am, of all those policies and still say none of that justifies Putin's invasion. And that the U.S. does not have a defense commitment to defend Ukraine. We don't have a defense alliance with them. They're not an ally. And Biden has tried very hard to stay out of this conflict. He's not looking for an excuse. There may be some people who are looking for an excuse that do want to take it to Russia, but Biden and his national security team, they are not in that camp. They've been trying to avoid this. But once that failed, once the war started, I don't know, how can you not aid those people? How can you sit by and watch them get killed?
The answer is the same way we stayed out of the Rwandan genocide, and the same way we stay out of most things that happen across the globe. This is not an argument that I'm making, but the how can we not seems to be uniquely tethered to this conflict, as though we are always similarly inspired to reach out of our humanitarian goals. And the reality is, if this were in many other situations, we would simply be ignorant as a population of what is going on, the same way the news fails to cover any number of other conflicts that are ongoing, especially those that are in the global south.
Yeah, I would say there's three core reasons. And the first are sort of general. This is happening to white people, not brown people, right? Right off the top. right off the top.
Hashtag they look like us.
Exactly.
It's parroted over and over again.
Right.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles.
Number two, video. It's been present in the other wars, but it is ubiquitous in this war. We are just getting impacted with this in a very visceral sense. And there's more video than you can process at this point. But the third is that it's in Europe. This is our strategic alliance. And this is more than race or ethnicity or blue eyes and blonde hair. This is our security alliance. This is NATO.
But why? See, that already is fundamentally part of the issue, because there are those on the left who argue that NATO has no need to exist as a defense pact against the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. This is the Frankenstein's monster that we've created. And there's 800 bases that we have all over the globe, all of which are ostensibly representing security interests in all part of the world. And yet those don't trigger this kind of involvement.
Yes. And so I'm a senior fellow or distinguished fellow. I'm old. Distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute, and a whole lot of people there think exactly what you think. The head of it, Andrew Bacevich, thinks we should get out of NATO. We shouldn't have it. So they think that. And I guess now that I think about it, I'm on the right flank of the Quincy Institute. You're exposing me. And part of it is, I agree with you. The reason we still have NATO is because we had a NATO. And at the end of the Cold War, we had this big, gigantic bureaucracy that was looking for a new justification for staying in existence. And it shouldn't have. It should have disbanded. The European Union could have been a much better vehicle for European integration than NATO. But now that you have this aggressor, this Putin, I mean, this is not made up. Yes, we mishandled this. Yes, we did a whole lot of terrible things wrong in the 90s and in the last 20 years especially. But Putin is no joke. This guy wants to occupy the countries that were formerly part of Russia and incorporate them into an enlarged Russia. And so you might think, well, for our allies, who now we do have defense agreements with, that's Poland, that's Latvia, Lithuania, that's the Baltics, that's Germany. And there's Germans are saying, whoa, we're not going to be in a war with Russia again. We got to stop this here. And if we don't stop it here, he's coming for us next. That's at least what the view was at the beginning of this conflict. Now that we're seeing how pathetic the Russian army is, some of those views might be changing.
So there's two parts of that. One part is that, as you kind of ended with there are a lot of folks who feel as though the initial reporting that characterized that first big Putin speech as evincing a desire to reconstitute the Soviet Union, that was incorrect. And that people at the time who watched the entire speech and listened to the entire speech felt like the spiritual commitment to the Soviet Union narrative that was proliferating through the media coverage of that speech was inaccurate and not reflected in the body of it in fact. And there was lots of other things that were emphasized, and that those remarks that were tied together to try to make this case that he was really going to go whole hog misrepresented the motivations there. I haven't listened to the speech, but that was what people were saying at the time. And it seems to be an increasingly common consensus. But the other part of this is that we keep sidestepping the question of why us. And this, I hate to quote Donald Trump, I hate to do it, but this is the point that he was always making about NATO. Separate and apart from your belief that Ukraine should have an ability, and these NATO countries, these European countries that are along Russia's flank, should be able to defend themselves. That's a separate question from America's involvement enabling to do so. And the thing that Trump used to complain about, bless his heart, is that America was pulling too much weight in NATO, and that these countries, we were spending all of our defense budget, we're spending all of our taxpayer dollars, in quotation marks, on a military budget that's 50% of our national budget. Meanwhile, all of these European countries are enjoying universal health care and housing guarantees and beautiful cobblestone streets and infrastructure that works. And we're footing the bill for them to be able to maintain that way of life. And so I wouldn't put it quite as in quite a mercenary way as Donald Trump would. But there is this question of, again, why, if there is a collective interest, obviously, among all of these countries, of not being invaded by Russia, even if you think that's truly gonna happen, why is the U.S. This is the primary imperialist question, anti-imperialist question. Why is the U.S. America's policeman?
But the world's policeman, yeah.
The world's policeman, yes.
Okay, I agree with you. We should not be. No, I agree with you. And this is a big debate in certain circles in Washington. And the argument goes, well, who do you want to run the world? Would you like China to run the world? Do you want France to run the world? The United States is imperfect, but it's a benign hegemon. I don't buy that argument. So I'm with you here. I honestly think we should be, after this war, we should be looking, we're not going to do it, but it'd be best if we could deconstruct NATO and turn it over to the European Union, and we should be disengaging from the direct defense of Europe and have the Europeans handle it themselves. We should be closing those bases. We should be withdrawing our military from, as you say, 800 bases around the world. This is the policy of restraint. We should be leading with diplomacy and economic assistance, more Marshall plans, less NATO's. So I agree with you. It's very hard to make that argument right now, because
we've induced reliance. There's a reliance interest that Europe has on our.
So you have this sort of question of the moment, like how do you resolve this war right now, so the fewest people die, so the most security is preserved, and you can't make that kind of change now. But I completely agree with you that a reckoning is coming, and right after this, we're going to have this fight about what the military budget should be after Ukraine. And a whole lot of people are going to be insisting that we have to go up to $1 trillion. Some people are calling for doubling the defense budget. So this is coming. You think of this conversation as a warm-up, trying out your arguments on me, and you're making headway. I mean, I'm listening to you, but it's going to happen in earnest after this war.
How about this one? While we're still in the middle of this kerfuffle. What is the argument? How confident are you? Because I've heard people say this, that to get to a diplomatic solution, faster, Russia has to believe it can't just bulldoze through and win. It's more likely to come to the negotiating table if it's getting a healthy pushback.
Yeah.
And to that end, supplying arms creates the forces that are going to force Russia to the negotiating table. How confident are you in that being the outcome? What is the evidence of that being the case?
I would say that nobody knows how this is going to end. And I mean that. I mean, it could go very worst case, like how we started. And it could go, best case, like Russia's army just collapses. The Ukraine army isn't going to collapse, but Russia's army could.
Is that likely?
Break it. It's not likely. No, but it could. I mean, here's the evidence.
Russia being what it is. I mean,
well, see, this is
enormous and resourced and full of people.
Right, which is why it's unlikely. However, nobody thought this war was going to go on for 4 weeks, and here we are. This is almost 4 weeks in. I think this is day 27, and the Russian offense has stalled. In strategic lingo, the offense has culminated. The Russians are no longer able to carry out offensive operations. They're not advancing. You look at the map today, and it looks the same as it did 2 weeks ago. Now, what that means is that they're relying on standoff attacks, artillery, rockets, missiles to pummel the cities, but they're losing militarily. It's kind of strange. The Ukrainian forces are on the counteroffensive. That's what's happening right now. They haven't been able to capture a major city. They haven't been able to encircle Kyiv, for example. And you can see as a result of this, Putin is starting to change his demands about what he's looking for. In the beginning of the war, he wanted to have a regime change war. Denazification, he called it, but get rid of the Ukrainian leadership. He's not calling for that anymore. He wanted to have a Ukraine that was neutral, but also demilitarized. Well, he's not really talking about demilitarization anymore. His core demands are Crimea be annexed, be recognized as part of Russia, and the Donbass region, so territory. He's not giving up on those, but you can see a softening of positions, and same with Zelensky, who started this war wanting to go into NATO, wanting to join the European Union. He's already, in the first few days, stopped talking about joining NATO. So you see, and this is sort of like classic international realist strategy. War changes the demands of the belligerents. Neither one can prevail on the battlefield. So what's the solution? There has to be a negotiated solution. And you're starting to see the core demands of the two sides come a little closer together. Unfortunately, not close enough so that one side is willing to make big concessions. But that may change if we go through what I think we're going to go through, another month of brutal war. I think both sides will be willing to concede more than they are now.
There is a famous episode of Star Trek, the original series.
Yeah?
Where the situation is this.
You're in my wheelhouse now. I'm just telling you.
Oh, yeah, you're a Trekkie?
Absolutely. Every single one. Okay,
no,
so go ahead.
I'm so excited about this. Okay, let me find the actual name of the episode. I think it's something about Armageddon. Wait a minute.
Okay.
Death, destruction, disease, horror. That's what war is all about.
The episode is called A Taste of Armageddon. And the premise is that there's a planet where there has been a civil war ongoing for a very long time. I'm talking like 1,000 years. But when you get to the planet, when Starfleet arrives, everything looks pretty peaceful. There's no bombed out buildings. There's no bodies in the street. Everything looks great. They're like, what's going on?
Right.
Well, a little like buzzer goes off and there's an alert that says so-and-so and so-and-so. A list of names has to report in. And what they've decided as a society is that instead of having actual warfare, they have computers run little simulations that calculate the number of deaths. And then there's basically a draft for people to report in and get killed.
Voluntary self-destruction. They get, vaporized inside a little booth. Very clean, no blood. Everything's peaceful. Everybody understands. And that's the way they do it. Yeah.
Correct. Now, Starfleet, the Captain Kirk in this
Kirk. It's not Starfleet. It's Kirk.
Starfleet's rule is non-interference. You got to let sleeping dogs lie.
Prime directive.
Exactly, Joe.
Oh, I told you.
Okay, but Kirk never wanted to follow the prime directive. The consummate cowboy is very upset. Plus, there's a very beautiful woman, of course, that he has fallen for, who is like having to report to the gas chamber or whatever. And he's like not wild about this. So he's making a big fuss and he says, this is unethical, da da da. And the people of the planet argue, we could not advance as a society. We couldn't have science and culture and all of these things if we were constantly blowing up the Sydney Opera House every other week. So I don't understand why you don't see this as a better ethical solution. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because it seems to me that what we're talking about is kind of spinning out where we are realizing the exchange that is not entirely unpredictable. Yeah. And that there is almost there are like a limited number of known outcomes here from the military conflict. And yet we're still going through the paces of the military conflict and having that death and that destruction and blowing up the opera houses actually, in order to get to a place that we arguably could have gotten to beforehand. And that also in Star Trek, being able to automate it didn't cause anyone to come to resolution. It just caused everybody to be able to sweep it under the rug and move on as a society and clean it up. And what happens in our version of that, our contemporary version of that, is that we turn off the cameras, we ignore what's happening in Yemen, we don't come to a negotiated solution, we just are blinkered. We have blinders on. We sanitize the reality by simply turning the cameras off of it. And so I have some skepticism. I am very frustrated by the idea that, well, if we ratchet it up here and we tweak it there and we send these arms there, it's going to improve the outcome. Because that has not been historically what it seems to me to have been the case. And also, if we know that there's a set number of outcomes. In the beginning, we could have said, all right, fine, look, give him Donbass and let's call it a day. But 3 weeks ago, people were not trying to hear that. And it's ridiculous to me that we have to have all of these people die and all of these communities traumatized because 3 weeks ago it felt improprietous. It felt weak. It felt like a cuck move to give Putin Donbas.
Yeah. So you're saying Ukraine, the Ukrainians are the equivalent of those citizens that are being brought into the vaporization booths.
Yes.
And we're just watching them go and we're just calculating, well, how many does it going to take? 20,000, 30,000? Before we went. And it's true. If our national security strategy was being decided by artificial intelligence, we would probably be doing what we're doing right now. That is to say, we would just keep arming the Ukrainians in order to bleed Russia dry. That this is one of our geopolitical rivals. They are in a quagmire in Ukraine. It is going to drain them. It may lead to the collapse of the Putin system as a result of this. And it's in our interest to just keep it going. And if the price of that is 20,000, 30,000 Ukrainians, well, and so that is a calculation. So you're definitely onto something. I would say that is not the primary motivation of American leaders at this point. That I don't think that is the way they're thinking. I think there are some who think that way and write that way. But I think most of them are like my sister. She just wants to kill Putin. She's not politically involved. She wants to just kill this guy. And we're not going to do that because you can't do that. And this is the other part of the code calculation. We're not going to militarily prevail. There's not going to be a clean victory here. It's going to have to be a negotiated solution. And to do that, you have to give Putin an off-ramp. He has to get something out of this, and he has to stay in power. So this is going to be a very unsatisfactory ending. Ukraine's going to be destroyed, at least parts of it, in this battle. And then to me, the question comes up after that, well, what's the lessons that we're learning? And I think you're pointing out some very powerful lessons. And your set of lessons are, we shouldn't have been in this position in the first place. Right?
Yes.
And that is the debate that we're going to have. But I tell you, knowing America, that is going to be a brief window, because we're going to be on to the next damn thing real quick. So we have to be ready to have that fight and say, here's what the principal lessons are, and here's what we should be demanding going forward. And there are people like Jayapal in Congress who are willing to, or Bernie Sanders, who believe this and will sort of be our political leaders on this, but they have to be pushed. And that requires voices, I think, like yours.
Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.